Today we're talking about everybody's favorite topic in church, money and stuff, right? Aren't you glad you came to church today? Yes. Yes. In the gospel passage, we read about the story of a man who comes to Jesus to ask for help settling a family dispute, right, about an inheritance. And in response, Jesus warns against greed. And he tells a parable about a man who stores up a lot of material wealth, and in the end he gets called a fool by God for his efforts. Seems like Jesus is setting up a dichotomy between those who store up treasure for themselves versus those who are, to use his words, rich toward God. It's a simple story, but I think a striking one. I was thinking this morning, sometimes you encounter teachings from Jesus that are difficult to understand. They take some time to unpack. You have to do a little bit of thinking or study to understand. Sometimes Jesus' teachings are really simple, but they're hard to absorb, right? Hard to practice. And I think this falls into that latter category. It's a straightforward story, but it's a difficult one to sort of be able to absorb and to practice. It's okay if this story challenges us, challenges our sort of sense of how things should be. It's a good thing. I think that means we're reading it the right way, if so. Jesus is very clearly trying to challenge his listeners in the story. It doesn't seem so bad to me to ask for help settling a family dispute, right? I mean, the guy just wants part of his family's inheritance. Fair is fair and all that. I think we'd be sympathetic if we heard someone in this situation. That's why it's important to say that the parable Jesus is telling is not really about the inheritance. It's not about family dynamics. Jesus is trying to make a universal point about how we relate to God, how we relate to one another, and how we relate to our stuff, our possessions, our material goods. The story that Jesus tells here is often called the parable of the rich fool. And I think we should be clear about why he gets called a fool. It's not because he's saving some resources for the future. In other places in the Gospels, Jesus occasionally talks about the need to be a good steward of that which we have been given. Jesus doesn't object in principle to being careful with what we have, to try and make sure that we're responsible for tomorrow. That's not the case. Something else is going on here. In Jesus' time, property rights had a really theological dimension. The Hebrew people, the Israelites, understood everything they had to be a gift from God. You might remember the stories in Exodus about Moses leading the people out of slavery in Egypt into the Promised Land. They spent a generation wandering in the wilderness before settling in Canaan, where they introduced intricate property laws. As those property laws get introduced throughout the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, one thing that gets emphasized over and over is that all the land they occupy, all of it, belongs exclusively to God. Even after they occupied the land, it never belonged to the people. They were there always as guests. Leviticus 25 quotes God as saying that the land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine and you reside in my land. That's God speaking. This is one of the central principles of faith as expressed in the Hebrew Bible, what we sometimes call the Old Testament. The whole world is God's, and all that everyone receives comes as pure gift from God. And the point of saying that frequently throughout Leviticus and Deuteronomy is so that the people come to understand that the land is to be used to ensure the welfare of everyone. God is constantly reminding the people of the need to provide for the poor, and specific rules are set up to ensure the care of widows and orphans and those in need, those who fall on hard times. Eventually, they even set up a practice where they reset property boundaries after a certain number of years so that no one builds up so much generational wealth that it causes stratification between members of the same society. And again, as God sets forth the law, the people are reminded that they are a people, a community, not just a collection of individuals. They're a collective whole, people who worship the same God, people who rise and fall together. people who are meant to live in mutual concern and in mutual flourishing. To quote Leviticus one more time, it says, "If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them, as you would a foreigner and a stranger, so they can continue to live among you. Do not take any profit from them, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend at interest. You must not sell food at a profit. I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan." At this time, the people live in a land-based agricultural economy. Much of what they had depended year to year on things outside of their control. Good weather for the production of crops, health of livestock. So to summarize where we are, because the world belongs to God, because all the resources the people have comes as a gift from God, the people are not to use the resources that they've received to profit at the expense of others. This gives us a different perspective on the parable we're looking at today. When we turn our attention back to it, we need to think about that perspective that Jesus' listeners would have had, one that's been conditioned by the values and the law of the Old Testament. As an introduction to the parable, Jesus tells the person who approached him about splitting the inheritance. He says to that person, "Be on guard against greed." And the word for greed gives a little bit of a different valence, I think, in the original. It says, "Be on your guard against having a lot." Be on your guard against having a lot. The having of a lot and the wanting of more, the seeking to possess a whole lot of anything, really. Money, power, influence, anything. Jesus knows that it will never be enough. That's a bottomless hole. You can't ever quench that thirst. And so you need to be on guard against that desire of much having, in Jesus' words. In the parable that Jesus tells, the man lives on land that produces abundantly. And the English translation doesn't really give us the feel of what Jesus says. In the Greek, the word used for abundantly comes from the same root word as euphoria. Jesus is saying the man is sitting on land that's almost gushing forth produce. It's as good as it can get. And that's what the story says, right? Things are going so well for the man, he doesn't have room for all the crops that are being produced. But instead of turning his attention to the needs of his neighbor, or even just thanking God, right? Thanks God for this incredible, abundant provision, the man focuses on hoarding, building bigger barns so he can store all the produce that his land is producing. The man doesn't get called a fool because he's saving for the future. He's a fool because God blessed him abundantly, and instead of turning his attention toward his neighbor, he turned his attention toward hoarding his stuff and prioritizing his own comfort. "I will say to my soul, you have goods laid up for many years. So relax, eat, drink, be merry." Those words, relax, eat, drink, be merry, are reproduced. Jesus is quoting from the book of Ecclesiastes, which says there's nothing better for people under the sun than to eat and drink and enjoy themselves, because this will go with them in their toil through the days of life God has given them. Jesus is rejecting that mindset. Jesus is saying, wait a minute, there's a larger horizon here, a larger meaning in life than just enjoying for today and storing up for tomorrow. There's a way to see these sorts of messages from Jesus as being scoldy, sort of finger waggy, as though Jesus is saying, don't have fun. You have to be miserable. That's not the case, though. In the book of John, Jesus says, "I have come that you might have life and have it more abundantly." And we know that Jesus finds time to enjoy himself in the Gospels too, right? He gets in trouble all the time for having dinner parties with disreputable people. He's eating and drinking with his followers at times he's not supposed to. So, that idea, don't ever allow yourself any comfort, don't be selfish, that's the wrong way to read it. Following Jesus is not fundamentally about refraining from certain stuff or making to do the right stuff so that God will love you. That's the wrong way to think about following Jesus. Our faith teaches us is that the way to life is to invest yourself, your resources, even your aspirations in something bigger than you, the divine reality, which happens to love you and happens to love everyone that you love too. That's how you find pleasure and security. Not just by avoiding the right stuff, not just by building up enough resources to protect yourself, insulate yourself from disaster. You can't do it. It won't work. And even if it could, Jesus says it wouldn't satisfy. There will always be hunger for more. So Jesus' invitation in this passage is to transcend that most fundamental temptation of human life, which is to try and earn security or love or influence through accomplishments, through wealth, through stuff. The paradigm that Jesus offers is one in which the love of God is the center of reality. All that we have, all that we are, is an unmerited gift from a lavish God who gives and invites us to do the same, secure in the knowledge that God's love will never leave us. One other thing comes to mind, which is at the end of the parable, God shows up and calls the man a fool. And he says, the man has just finished saying, soul, eat, drink, be merry, enjoy yourself. And God says, tonight, your soul will be required of you. It's that same word that the man just used about himself. I find it really interesting that it's left ambiguous. We don't know what that means. Your soul will be required of you. I think Jesus is offering this parable as a mirror. What would it mean for your soul to be required of you? For my soul to be required of me? I think that's the question of this passage, and I invite you into it with me.